to our panelists, our in-person audience. So lovely to be in touch with each other again. Our online audience and the organizers who are holding this all together. I am Lee Esterhazen, Chief Exec and founder of And Wider. We're a worker engagement provider and basically a human rights data provider. We do worker engagement in 47 countries and 12 sectors, so reaching and listening to migrant workers to identify exploitative practices and then to track improvements and when those practices start to get resolved is absolutely central to what we do. So it's a privilege to be part of this panel. I want to introduce you to our panelists, but I'm going to steal a leaf out of Joe Martinez's book from the previous panel, because Joe very kind of deftly said profiles are online on the platform. I'm going to almost do the same. I'd love to introduce each of the panelists briefly, but please, these three have got quite extraordinary backstories, so please dip into those profiles to read about them more. Wanted to say that right next to me, also in Navy, as Amy has just pointed out, is Amy Lohr. Amy's Assistant General Counsel for Human Rights and Sustainability at Mars. And essentially, her role is to develop policy and systems to help Mars meet legal requirements and to act consistently with international best practice. I then want to touch on Mark. This is Mark Taylor from the Itzer Institute. Welcome. Mark's post for Itzer is the Senior Director for Strategy and Global Partnerships. And in that role, essentially, he shapes the direction of Itzer's business and human rights, ethical recruitment, and inclusive labor monitoring work. And thirdly, meet Gerardo Reis. Welcome. Gerardo is a key leader of the coalition of Immokalee Workers. And in that role, he essentially organizes national actions. He recruits retailers to join the Fair Food Program and is directly involved in conducting workers' rights education in the fields on farms participating in the program, and also receives complaints of abuses related to wage theft claims and assisting in the investigation of cases of modern-day slavery when they arise. So you can see that I have a panel that are quite well equipped to address the topic we have today. So to that point, the topic we have today, on this panel we've been tasked with discussing methods, tools, and experiences that can help our audience with two things. The one is to better listen to the voices of migrant workers and identify where recruitment and labor practices need urgent attention. And that builds rather beautifully on the previous panel. And secondly, to cover how we can better amplify migrant workers' voices in today's global supply chains. In the context of global supply chains, migrant workers are now, due to the casualization of labor, the pandemic, and the impact of the recent economic downturn, both more central to the functioning of global supply chains and simultaneously more at risk when it comes to unethical practices. But on a positive side, thanks to a series of new laws, brands are now required in a growing number of geographies to assess, address, track, and remediate where necessary the exploitation of workers generally, including, of course, migrant workers that are a special cohort and frequently subjected to the more exploitative side of those practices. This means brands need to be better plugged in to the experiences of migrant workers along their supply chain, and many of these new laws are quite clear in stipulating that grievance mechanisms and stakeholder engagement are necessary, so that brands can monitor supply chains for exploitative practices and address what they find together with their suppliers. But being better plugged in to the experience of migrant workers is a need, of course, but how does that work in practice? So we're going to address how do we best amplify the voices of migrant workers. I have an excellent panel to address that point because we have the luxury of hearing from Mars, a large multinational with extraordinary reach in terms of sectors and geographies, but also with a deep experience of wide-ranging experience of different worker engagement solutions. An institute, Itzer, who have built multiple tools to support migrant workers in Asia, and a workers' coalition in the form of the Coalition for Immokalee Workers, who has engineered a model that takes migrant workers, their employers, retailers, and the consumer from a situation of extreme exploitation as the norm to a situation in which migrant workers are heard, respected, and central to the effective running of farms and ethical rewiring of supply chains. So I'm about to give it over to my panelists, but before we dive in, I want to have a little frank confession. You'll notice in the subtext for this panel today that while the title was about amplifying workers' voices, I'm looking at Neil apologetically, amplifying workers' voices, in the subtext there was a specific focus on grievance mechanisms. Now, on talking to my three panelists, we chose to do a slight broadening and reframing there. As some of you will be aware, the term grievance mechanism is evolving. You'll find that in conferences, presenters are regularly referring to the distinction between traditional grievance mechanisms on the one hand and grievance systems or worker engagement systems on the other. The difference being that the latter, worker engagement systems and grievance systems, move beyond the individual worker lodging a complaint to enable workers to identify exploitation and seek remedy to drive improvements using other channels. In this wider category, we find engagement with workers via mobile surveys, also referred to as direct worker reporting or worker voice. We find engagement with workers via social media channels, and we find dedicated worker engagement apps. It's indeed this wider framing that the panel will be working with today. And but having said that, again back to Neil, we will certainly be addressing the role of effective grievance mechanisms and the failings thereof where applicable. But our panel also wished to go further still, and all of us kind of mutually recognize that amplifying migrant workers' voices only truly becomes impactful only when you recognize the crucial need for certain preconditions or preparatory work to be done, and the crucial need for follow-up, actions to drive improvements and remedies where needed. So I'll stop there. You've now got the framing. I want to ask our panel, we'll be using 4 questions to guide the conversation. And so I wanted to start with our first question, which is the broad one. How can we best amplify the voices and address the grievances of migrant workers? What are the channels, tools, approaches each of you as panelists have witnessed as impactful? And please feel free to provide examples. So starting with you, Amy.
Well, thank you. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what my panelists have to say, because there is no silver bullet on this one. And so I'll talk about some of the options that we've explored, as a company, what I've seen work, but again, I don't have the answer as to what is truly effective. One piece of the puzzle is, of course, traditional grievance mechanisms. So complaint boxes, hotlines, et cetera, the things that we've had around for a long time. And those certainly do have a role. So I'll talk quite a bit about maybe a program that we have in place with our first tier suppliers. It's called Supplier Advance, and it involves assessment of worker conditions and then 9 months or more of capacity building provided by expert third parties for those suppliers. But woven into that are lots of different forms of grievance mechanism, worker engagement, et cetera. So I'll start by saying we almost always find that an effective grievance mechanism ends up being part of that work, of that capacity building, because usually grievance mechanisms are not what they could be and what they should be to understand ongoing problems. Worker voice has been an interesting addition in recent years. I will start out by saying I was a skeptic. I didn't think anyone would answer the questions honestly when it's coming in through some device, but I actually now am convinced that it does have a really important role to play. Again, not by itself, but as part of an ecosystem. And we're finding that issues float up that way that don't come in through traditional grievance mechanisms. And that you're able to see problems at scale as well. So I'll just give a few examples. One of our suppliers, it turned out, had quite a high injury rate. And they didn't even know because they had, normal health and safety systems, but the workers didn't realize they should be reporting or weren't reporting. I'm not quite sure which it was, but really it was an unrecognized problem where all of a sudden they realized they had a health and safety problem, like kind of a bread and butter issue. But it hadn't come in through the normal channels, and worker voice was really how that supplier learned about it, and there are many more examples of that. I've also been surprised by kind of, workers will talk about things like harassment through worker voice, which I personally did not think would happen. They'll raise really serious issues through it, which, again, has been to my surprise. Another piece of the puzzle is worker engagement done well. Again, very hard to do well. We're doing some interesting work supporting our suppliers as they do work on this. So one of our suppliers is doing a really formal training for their middle management and their workers. I mean, it sounds, maybe it shouldn't be necessary, but it is. How do you talk to each other? How do you have real conversations on a regular basis about the issues that are bothering workers, whether they're big, I paid recruitment fees, or small. The food in the canteen is not good, and it is disgusting, and I don't want to eat it. So I think that that's important too. We've done training at our own sites. At some of our sites that have particularly vulnerable populations, helping our teams there have the skill set, again, to engage with vulnerable workers on a regular basis. So it's not a formal grievance mechanism, it's an ongoing conversation. And we had a third party come in who has a lot of experience interviewing workers, engaging with workers to help our teams know how to do that properly. Because I don't think this is actually that easy, even though it may seem like it should be intuitive. And I will just say, we have suppliers that are increasingly doing their own recruiting in country. And I would imagine that that kind of training would be really vital for those situations too. If you really want workers to tell you when they don't know you about their recruitment journey, right? That's not a natural thing to do. Last, I will say, this is again kind of old school. There's just on-the-ground assessment, and that is really important too. It's a snapshot in time. You can't do it all the time. That's something like worker voice is really helpful because you can do it more frequently. But those old-fashioned assessments, whether it's in a supply shed at a farm level or in a factory, we still find that that's vital when it's done by really experienced people. So I'll stop there because I have a feeling they have much more granular, interesting things to say.
Mark, over to you.
Great, thank you. So I work for an organization called the Itzer Institute. We primarily focused in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And really since inception, worker voice has been underpinning the work that we do. How can we empower workers? We're running multilingual helplines as well as increasingly using social media, sort of close Facebook chats or just messaging platforms like Line, Telegraph, Viber, or WhatsApp as ways to be communicating directly to workers. And one of the things that we realized early on, as you're running grievance mechanisms and hearing directly, I think right now it's attuned to about 15,000 calls and messages from workers per month. you know, a lot of the risks and vulnerabilities that have come through the recruitment channels. And so one of the things, you know, that very early on in sort of the communications with the, you know, the partners, the brands and retailers that we work with is to highlight the need to be operating in the origin countries. Or if you're not operating there, find partners who are. In this, because, you know, what can happen is you can be looking for, okay, we're doing a more traditional assessment, you know, of, you know, worker satisfaction surveys or recruitment surveys to find out, you know, what the realities that workers have experienced, you know, what kind of fees they've paid, but also more importantly, you know, what were the root causes. And so I think for me, in terms of, you know, really trying to highlight or kind of steer direction for what needs to be done and some of the good practice, and that's actually operating in the origin countries when you have foreign migrant workers, but really focusing on the prevention. Because you can be going, you know, from an employer pays perspective or just trying to find legal recruitment, you can go ahead and you know, have workers, you know, seek remedy, justice. They can go ahead and repay the fees that they, you know, had incurred. A lot of times there's deception, there's other, you know, serious vulnerabilities. But if you can address those at the time that they're job seekers, that's absolutely critical. So we're talking about, you know, how can you get better information in the hands of job seekers? How can you, you know, allow them to have more informed decisions about what the nature of work is going to be like? How can you push out those brokers and those middlemen for paying those, you know, 6 months of fees? You know, we heard the example in Bangladesh, it could be even up to, you know, several years of fees that migrant workers are facing. And so the more that we can go ahead and, you know, work with local partners and work in the origin countries, you have a lot of opportunities to address those kind of risks at the root cause, you know, before they take place. And so for Itzer, you know, we do have an app as well. It's called Golden Dreams. It's a Yelp-like platform where migrant workers can share and rate and review their employers, their recruitment agencies, service providers. A few years back, we added a marketplace as well. And what we've found is, you know, in the beginning, before there was actually the jobs there, migrant workers would be asking, this is great, really helpful information. It's a platform that I'm hearing from my, you know, my peers, other workers, when they're in origin countries or in destination and they've returned. But where are the good jobs? And so, you know, with the addition of the marketplace, this is one where we've really realized that it's not about just having that app or the tools we've talked about before, it's really about the ground game. And so, you know, we've been in the process now, I think there's about 34 different organizations, 6 local trade unions that we've partnered with, and we're really building out their own channels and their own network that they have, because they're already invested in across the localities. You know, you have migrant workers at the village level who are really trying to find, you know, what those job opportunities, but how do you have the hotlines and the different, you know, feedback mechanisms that can occur at that first mile. And so that's what we're really trying to build out, and think it's been effective.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. And over to you, Gerard.
Well, from our part, I would say, you know, there's nothing, as a farm worker and as part of the coalition of Immokalee Workers for the past 20-something years, I got involved when there was no Fair Food program, which is what we call the solution to the problems in the fields. And we were actually in the juncture between, you know, focusing on Immokalee, trying to transform an industry that wasn't ready to recognize the humanity of the workers themselves. There were several actions. There was a hunger strike by 6 workers that went without food for 30 days. And when a grower was asked, why was it so hard to sit at the table? It was asked by another smaller grower. And they were saying, you know, these workers have gone to the hospital in really bad shape, and they are all asking for dialogue. You don't have to concede anything, but don't you think that they have earned that space on the table? The answer of this grower was something that captured basically how they were looking at their workforce. They said, I'm going to put it to you this way. A tractor doesn't tell a farmer how to run his farm. That pushed our community to start thinking, instead of the question of the organizer, which states, how do we make these abuses stop? And instead, we added the question of the economist, which states, who's benefiting the most? When we started to analyze that question as a community, we realized that there were a lot of brands from the retail food industry that decades before that moment, didn't exist in the way they did at that moment and had the influence to actually demand the highest quality of the produce they needed, in this case, tomatoes mainly, and also the price. They were using something that in the retail food industry they call the power of the purchasing order to drive prices down to the benefit. When that happened, you can see clearly why farm workers were receiving, since 1978 and for the next 30 plus years, the same wages per bucket. It was a 40 to 45 cents. That meant that there was a direct connection between the extreme poverty and the perpetuity of those wages being stagnant with the incredible power and wealth that was continuing to grow on the top of the food chain. So we said to ourselves, if the market, by its inaction when it comes to farm workers in their supply chain, is sentencing workers to live in a situation in which they have to endure sexual harassment, they have to endure wage theft, violence in the fields, and in the most extreme, conditions of modern day slavery, where workers have been forced to work at gunpoint under threats of death for them and their families. In many cases that we have helped by working undercover sometimes, gathering evidence for the FBI, and bringing those cases to a resolution. We knew that we needed a power that was bigger than the industry that we were aiming to change. And that's why we decided to start what we call the Campaign for Fair Food. We started with Taco Bell. We were very naive, thinking that they are going to be really happy once we tell them the dream that we have as workers. When we read the Declaration of Human Rights, all of those were only aspirations. We knew that none of that would apply to us, that we needed to fight for it. So we thought they're going to be excited to be part of the solution. If the market stands with us, we can then influence the growers to create the mechanisms that are necessary to eliminate all of these abuses, and not just to identify problems, but if we have enough power from the retail food industry, we will be able to prevent conditions of abuse and even modern day slavery, sexual assault, and other problems. With that idea in mind, we started with Taco Bell. 2005, they came on board because there were hundreds of universities across the country standing in solidarity with the workers of Immokalee. There were the National Council of Churches, just to give you an example of people of faith, 32 different denominations, 50 million people of faith that in one way or another heard from us and got involved. They would give us food. They would give us the floors to sleep. When we were in tours, across the country, talking about the conditions that we were aiming to eliminate. Everything was based on a theory of change. And the inspiration that we drew was an inspiration that came out of the suffering. That was our most powerful weapon. Once we reached the agreement in 2005, then McDonald's came on board, Burger King, Subway, all with a campaign, obviously. The boycott of Taco Bell was the first boycott. We have now a second boycott focusing on Wendy's. We're asking them to also join onto the program. In total, we have 14 corporations. That is the power that is needed, because you cannot negotiate anything that you don't have the power to negotiate. You need to build power in the side of the community, and that's what we built. These 14 agreements gave us the opportunity to land, finally in 2011, the implementation of the Fair Food Program, with the participation of growers represented under the Florida Tomato Growers Exchange. 90% of an industry based in Florida with production all over the East Coast. When Walmart came on board in 2014, we were able to expand to other states. Right now, we are implementing the program in agriculture in the US in 9 states. And we're in conversation on how to land these changes in other places in the world. So this is going globally in agriculture. But at the same time, this has served as a blueprint to be able to create the mechanisms that makes it possible for other realities to also be implementing something similar like we did. The Fair Food Program, it's like a blueprint, that worker-driven social responsibility, or WSR, is the result. And it is being implemented in other sectors, in other industries, like the textile industry, in Bangladesh, in Lesotho. And there's an exploration to also work in the fishing industry and other sectors. So this has no limits. The only limitation is our imagination once we understand that this is a power that can be applied in different parts of the globe, but that the most important part about it is the empowerment of workers as the leaders of that power, not as a subject matter, not as a topic of conversation within a system that comes from above, but as a system that is actually created by workers themselves. We, in our small community, created the list of rights that needed to be part of the code of conduct. And in other places in the world, the same is being done. So we are supporting on those efforts. And as I said, without power, you cannot negotiate anything that makes sense to you, to your reality as a worker.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gerardo. So beautiful examples from the Supplier Advance Program to providing kind of the means to amplify workers' voices in particular workplaces, to Sarah, ensuring that workers can use their voices to identify root causes and to express what they really needed, to find out where the good jobs lay. And your example of workers essentially, the kind of amplified voice being used to direct the movement and to set standards for retailers. So the second question is, what are the elements the three of you recognize that made these effective, that made these examples you've cited effective specifically for migrant workers? Amy, can I start with you again?
Sure, and I do feel like others on the panel will be able to expand on some of the, I think, obvious things I'm going to say. Obviously, migrant workers, look, grievance mechanisms are hard for anyone to use. I wouldn't be eager to use a grievance mechanism, right? And I'm in a pretty empowered position. And obviously, migrant workers face special challenges, including ones as simple as language, or in some cases, illiteracy. So sometimes there are just obvious opportunities. I'll give one example. One of our suppliers had a grievance mechanism that was written only, and most of their workers were illiterate, right? These are things you can fix, but you have to look. And so I do still think there are some easy wins in some places around creating just thinking about the basics of how people can communicate. I think I want to talk about this more in terms of opportunities, so we'll get to it later, but I think culture is a big piece of this too, and a really tough one to crack. And then I guess another factor I think about is the role of a grievance mechanism or some form of worker engagement. Is it only about the worst things? So I'm a lawyer, right? I'm worried about, do we have people paying recruitment fees somewhere in our supply chain? But that's not the only problem workers can have. And I actually think addressing smaller problems that to a corporation may seem small, but are not small to those workers, are a really important way to start building trust and start a process that can help you get to the deeper issues. Where again, a migrant worker might not be very eager to come to their employer with a very serious problem, but you can start with smaller things.
Over to you.
Sure, thank you. Okay, so there's a bunch of things that we could potentially cover. I think one is just around access and inclusivity. Making sure, and that's one of the reasons why, at least for Itzer, it's having multiple different channels that workers feel comfortable to access at a time and location they feel most comfortable basically utilizing. And along those lines as well too, the empowerment, the knowing your rights, the being able to find a good recruitment agency, a good employer, what happens when you actually arrive, at the destination, at the factory site, the working conditions there, the needs and the information that workers or job seekers to workers will face will change. It's dynamic, and so I think that's one of the valuable things that tech can bring to the picture is that And in this case, you can have a grievance mechanism, you can have these kind of, more information for workers that basically goes and travels with the worker from the origin all the way to the destination till where they return back home again. So I think there definitely is different needs for information at different stages, especially as, the migrant worker registration system, is constantly changing. If you're, trying to tackle more serious issues like forced labor, obviously it's very dynamic and things change. And I think that's one of the values that worker voice that's really ongoing can provide, and different from social audits, is the sense that, it's continuous. And I think from a recruitment perspective, there's a lot of, I think, emphasis on, the employer pays model, which obviously is fantastic and is much needed. But the realities for so many migrant workers is that they just don't have those job opportunities. There's just, when we talk about what's happening within the marketplace, there's few to employers that are willing to go ahead and pay for, demand that kind of level of service from the recruitment agencies. The vast, vast majority of migrant workers, we're just trying to go ahead and say, is there a legal channel that we can go ahead and ensure? And fantastic, there's more opportunities for employer pays, but at the very least, can it be legal? So from that perspective, engaging with those recruitment agencies, especially the ones that are more progressive, and in many cases, it's the recruitment agencies, they can actually be, I think there's a lot of sort of focus, and there are some bad apples out there, but there are a lot of recruitment agencies that want to do the right thing. The terms and conditions of the contracts, the management services agreement that they have with the employer in many cases, it's very limited. The price just keeps getting bumped down per head because there's other recruitment agencies that are willing to go ahead and basically charge less because that comes on the back of workers. And so if you're trying to go ahead and really drive improvements, I think part of it is looking at, what is that power dynamic? What does those contracts look like between employers and the recruitment agencies? And then how can that information get out to those job seekers as well, so they can understand, if it's no fees, fantastic, or if there are fees, what are the allowable fees along with those working conditions. And so I think combined, and if you're able to hear from workers throughout that journey, it can make for a powerful tool for workers and for business.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. Over to you, Gerardo.
Well, a few thoughts that come to mind. The workforce in the United States changed dramatically because politics were too focused on villainizing farm workers, villainizing migrants in this country. And when that happened, that created a fear within the agricultural industry because they had a really valid point when they were thinking, with this push of anti-immigrant laws nationally when Trump was in office, what's going to happen if they come to our farms, which they did at some point. That infused a lot of fear because there were millions and millions of dollars of investment in the ground, literally. So the beginning of H2A in a more broader form brought also this fake belief among people in this country of safety, of like somehow because people are coming under an H2A visa, they're safe from the typical abuses that other workers confront. And nothing could be farther, and I don't know if I'm saying that right, from the truth. The reality is that H2A has been used since its implementation and expansion in the country as the way to recruit people, impose debts, bring them to the US without any kind of oversight. You have basically workers that are dependent absolutely in regards to where they stay, when they go to the store, mobility, everything in one person. And what we have seen, I can mention a few examples of the cases that have come to our attention. One of them being the Blooming Onion case that was closed in 2001, or the indictment was presented in 2021, sorry. This case involved 71,000 workers that were forced to work with a debt of $2,200 each. They were paid 20 cents per bucket of onions, the way that they were forced to dig with their bare hands. This is just an example. They were able to money launder more than $200 million in a casino in Tampa. This is what happens with a system that has no oversight, right? In other example, there was a case in Pahokee where workers were forced to work in the watermelon fields under the same conditions and the threats of death for them, their families. They had to escape on a truck, on the back part of a truck. And these are just a few examples of things that continue to happen. There's other cases under investigation. Why do I share this? Because it is necessary to understand what we are up against and to be able to then counter or place what we have as a solution to understand the urgency and expanding it. In our case, the elements that make this work is the Fair Food Program and the WSR are models that not just empower people, they protect them with the power of the market. In one end, you have workers that are able to complain without any kind of retaliation, and there's a resolution that they see themselves happening in real time. In the other side, you have corporations that have signed legally binding agreements, and they are ready to cut purchases if necessary for incompliance. And in the cases of zero tolerance, which include modern-day slavery, sexual assault, and child labor, then that's automatic. You're not going to be able to sell, in this case, your tomatoes if you're allowing any of these bad actors into your operation. It is your responsibility as an employer to make sure that you don't have abusive bosses leading your workers. So when you have those two things, then the other parts you create to be able to make it work. The Fair Food Standards Council, for example, is an organization that was created with the task of overseeing the implementation of the Fair Food Program and also guarantee or oversee compliance at both levels, at the level of the grower and also at the level of the corporations that have signed on to the program. They also account for one of the things that every buyer, every corporation participating does, which is they pay a premium that goes directly to the workers. It's not much, but it goes to cover every pound of tomatoes that you harvest in the fields. Since the implementation of the program until today, and taking into account that it covers close to 30,000 workers within this industry, there's been more than $42 million that have been distributed in the form of a bonus. So all of those things alleviate the state of vulnerability in which workers live, allowing them to be able to speak up, bringing all of this information directly from the fields, and having the power of the market ready to be used as a blessing. If you're doing a good thing in the implementation of these rights, then it's going to be a blessing for any farm that is doing it because these corporations are going to buy from them. If you are not, then you have work to do because nobody should be subject to any kind of abuse, any kind of sexual harassment, any kind of violence or modern-day slavery. So that should be, the market saying we are not going to participate doing business in this form until you change. And that's what we've seen. This has changed everything from the way in which we are recruited, which also include collaborations with the National Service of Employment in Mexico, SNE. And we have been able to eliminate the recruitment fees that do exist everywhere else, and that's the sad part. We have a horrible scenario for workers outside of the Fair Food Program, and we have an opportunity with expanding the Fair Food Program to be able to eliminate all of these situations from continuing to happen.
Beautiful, thanks Gerardo. So the elements that are identified include inclusive by design, grievance systems that are inclusive in terms of literacy and language, that we need to build trust in environments before expecting grievance systems to work. The tech can deal with the dynamic and changing nature of migration kind of corridors and recruitment practices, and can provide information to workers wherever they are. that you need grievance systems that both empower and protect workers, a point just mentioned by Gerardo, and that the amplification of workers' voices needs to be tied directly and materially to compliance. Compliance by growers and compliance also by retailers. So there are real material consequences when workers voice a particular issue for the kind of powers that be. So then the third question is, briefly to my panelists, because we're going to have to be a little bit more, I'm going to have to be a bit more Dutch in my timing. Terrible stereotype, apologies to the Dutch. Now, where do traditional grievance mechanisms sometimes fail migrant workers, and why? I know, Amy, you've already touched on them, but please go ahead.
So maybe I'll try to group my comments into two buckets. One is around culture. And there's two pieces of that. I already talked a little bit about workers having confidence and trust in systems, and that can be quite hard. But there's also the question we find with our suppliers being really nervous about using a tool like worker voice, because as I understand it, they're afraid that workers will express concerns and they won't be able to address them, or it will create unrest, right? So there's this real nervousness about opening that door, or opening that box, I suppose I should say. What we found is that when our suppliers do it, after we work on it for a while, they really, really appreciate what they learn, and they are able to act on what they find. And it is actually quite transformative in many cases, but it's hard. You have to really spend the time making the case for it. And obviously one opportunity there is to have not just the big brands, but our suppliers sharing those experiences with each other so that there is more comfort with that kind of approach. So that's around culture. And there's practicalities, and we've kind of touched on some of that, but this isn't a barrier, this is more it's a barrier with an opportunity that I'm excited to see where it goes. People at sea on vessels are obviously really vulnerable because they're at sea for a long time. They are often migrants from vulnerable countries and challenging countries. And we have a supplier that has done import audits and things, but wanted to do more than that. And so we're supporting their effort to test out worker voice on vessels. So we're really curious to see what kind of information that brings back in terms of a way to really know on an ongoing basis what the conditions of workers are on individual vessels. Obviously, then there's a question about how you remediate that. Again, they're at sea, it makes it harder, but there is the power of the pocketbook. So I don't know where that's gonna land, ask me in about a year or two, but I think it's a really interesting opportunity to, again, in a situation where there's a really substantial barrier to getting information, there is an opportunity, so let's hope that that pans out as we hope.
Brilliant. Mark.
So I think for some of the challenges we've seen across different grievance mechanisms, it's helpful to kind of describe a little bit more which type grievance or which mechanism we're talking about. So in general, when it's sort of neutral, third-party, independent grievance mechanisms, there's been a lot of, I think, good examples and successes because it comes down to trust at the end of the day. I know certainly for Itzer, a lot of times when we're first entering a factory, that's one of the first things that workers ask. Who paid for you to be here? Is it my employer, or are you really independent? At the same time, I think the aim is to try to build up the improvements in the trust deficit that often there is between a worker and an employer. So how can you strengthen an employer's own grievance mechanism in that process? And I think this is also where a lot of the challenges arise, because of past experiences where there just hasn't been a well-functioning mechanism in place, at that supplier or that employer level. And so some of the big challenges, in that space, one is communication back to those that have actually kind of put themselves at risk, a little bit more vulnerable by stepping up and sharing, these are the different issues that are arising. Sometimes a lack of confidentiality, that an individual may face. Fear of reprisals is obviously a massive one. So making sure that there are safeguards in place for those individuals that are sharing. And then I think, and even in the recruitment process to extend it a little bit further, you see sometimes well-intentioned, employers are actually going out, taking that extra step, if it's a foreign migrant worker, going to the origin countries and meeting with workers there, in addition to sometimes, doing different surveys once those workers arrive back at their location. But sometimes what we've seen, in that process of wanting to go ahead and engage with a worker, sort of at that interview process, pre-departure training, they're in interview stage, they would ask workers to go ahead and, have you paid any fees? And sometimes have workers sign a declaration, that I have not paid any fees. That simply just doesn't work. I mean, if you're a job seeker, that you've already paid fees, you're not going to go ahead and likely, the indebtedness you may have already gone into, you're not going to go ahead and forego that because of a very good chance then that you won't be accepted. So many times workers feel pressure, even if they had paid fees, to go ahead and sign something saying that they hadn't. The employer is saying, okay, that's here to protect myself or my brand or retailer who has a policy. But the reality is it just kind of drives it underground until potentially it comes up at some later date and time. So I think the recommendation, I think in those cases, is just to really work on the better systems, the different channels that workers might trust. Obviously, there's a time and location where some of these things are more likely to rise. So I think those are some of the challenges that come up.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. Gerardo.
Well, I think that I would use a phrase, no todo lo que brilla es oro. Not all that shines is gold. To say this, we have seen how for more than 3 decades, the idea, the notion of corporate social responsibility, CSR, was this nice idea on trying to bring social responsibility into the supply chains, and we know why it failed. It failed because it never really included workers. It failed because it never really aimed to alleviate the problems that happen at the bottom, especially at the bottom of their supply chain. It was an approach that sounded good in paper, but after 30 years of failure, I think that we should just get rid of it altogether, that notion, and start to think in a new way. There's another thing that I want to mention. There is a study that took place in Harvard, MSI Integrity or MS Integrity, did a study for 10 years without us knowing that they were actually doing that in terms of different programs, different initiatives of our time that were being deployed to basically alleviate abuses, eliminate abuses, right? And they realized, I think they studied about 60 different initiatives and concluded that only one of them stood up as one that actually resolves the problems that it was created to resolve. And that was the Fair Food Program. That's not us saying it, that's plenty of data that can explain why all of this makes sense for us to expand it. But we cannot do it alone. We need the support of all of you. If what we want to do is to see more iterations of the Fair Food Program in the form of a WSR model, then we need to get close to this, and we need to also study what doesn't work and why. I'm not going to get into the details because ultimately, I think that we have something beautiful right here in the US that is expanding rapidly. There's a lot of interest globally, and the only thing that we need is for more people to realize that we all could, stand behind this and use any power that we have to push together, because the narrative that continues to stand in the way comes from corporations that are trying to escape real responsibility, that are trying to come up with codes of conduct, co-opted the language of human rights, dignity, all of those things that we talk about because we are hungry for it. It's being co-opted, and we need to actually focus on what the results are. In our concrete example, the Fair Food Program has demonstrated a type of power that actually brings the agricultural industry that once denied that we were human beings to be active participants in the transformation, to serve as an example to the rest of the food production in this country, by collaborating in a form that protects workers' lives, workers' dignity, and in lieu, for example, of COVID-19, the Fair Food Program, in collaboration with these growers, was able to create the only protocols that are enforceable within the U.S., within the U.S. agriculture, to protect workers with clear step-by-step things that were defined by the industry to do the best, at confronting this. Another one, it's extreme heat. We have protocols to protect workers with mandatory stops that were just expanded. It was from May to October, which are the hottest months of the year. Now we expanded it from April 15 to November 15 because we have seen the increase on temperatures during these months, and we don't want people to risk their lives while they are working. And lastly, in terms of modern day slavery, growers, when they sign on to the Fair Food Program, they basically hire directly every worker so that they embrace the responsibility that comes with it. In cases of abuse, they will make sure that the abuse is fixed.
Thank you, Gerardo. There was one more question about the last bit of advice that each of the panelists would provide when it comes to setting up channels, including, but not limited to, effective grievance mechanisms that genuinely empower migrant workers to report abuses and seek remedy. How about one piece of advice each before we turn to the audience for questions?
Well, generally, I would just say it's hard, and you have to keep at it and try lots of different channels. I think this conversation points out just the larger ecosystem, that a grievance mechanism for workers at a work site by itself is not going to fix the system. That is why we have laws and law enforcement, and we're seeing the growth of laws, especially in the EU, to make some of this much more formal. And I think that that is also really powerful and important, right? There is a role, of course, for company grievance mechanisms, worker engagement, all of that, but it's not enough on its own.
Great, Mark.
I think there's, it's exciting in the sense that there's a lot more channels available for workers to share information that's of importance to them. I think that when we talk about grievance mechanisms, it's really important. Then it is hard to go ahead and operate hotlines and to be running that. So I would say, one, make sure that you're prepared to go ahead and receive the information that comes in. It's not just for due diligence purposes. You have a responsibility to go ahead and act on it, the information that comes in, on an ethical manner. And similarly, in terms of the data collection or that process, to make sure that there's informed consent and that individual on the other side really has a good, clear indication of what's going to happen with the information. How is it going to be used? How is information is going to be reported back in terms of resolution?
Brilliant. Thank you. And Gerardo, one piece of advice.
I would say support workers when they are trying to create the solutions for their own problems. And, I think the true power really emerges once the power of experiences, regardless of language. Sometimes it can be assumed that because we don't come from the world of academia, our voices or what we are bringing to the table is not as valid. And those notions, we need to change them. We need to sit at the table and have real conversations with one another, understand the dreams that people that are suffering have, understand the limitations in the path to achieve those dreams, but also do our part understanding that this is not something that, in our case, workers are asking as a favor. We have already fed and placed the food in every single table in this country. We deserve better. So I would say, let's get closer, let's get working together to understand how to better support each other. Thanks.
Brilliant. We haven't ended yet. It's your turn now to ask some questions. Please go ahead.
So we have 5 minutes. That's the most time we had all morning for questions. So I'm going to be rather ambitious, and I have group questions today from online and in-person questions into 3 broad categories. And I think they follow really well from the round of questions you just answered now. So I have one. People in the audience were very curious about what lessons can be drawn from the initiatives that you spoke of, with the purpose of applying it to their own work. So we have, people talked about things like, Mark, you mentioned access, inclusivity, and being continuous. Gerardo, you spoke of empowerment and building wider solidarity. So the follow-up question is, how can worker voices become more normalized in companies' own human rights due diligence processes? So that's cluster number 1. 2 is a very reflective question, and it's perfect. Second part question to Gerardo's last comment. It is, to what extent have people who have been migrant workers been involved in the process for developing policies on responsible recruitment themselves? I think that's a really good reflective question as we look around the room as well. And the third one is going back to the theme of technology. So we have one participant who remarked that a lot of technology solutions and mechanisms tend to atomize the worker. It puts the burden of reporting on them. And the question is, Gerardo, you spoke of this wider solidarity and collective action, and you remarked yourself that it was a rare example. Why is it so rare, and how can we look at replicating more of your successes in other sectors? Thank you.
Great. So, who wants to take the first one about how can worker voice be normalized in human rights due diligence?
Go ahead.
I can just say something briefly, which is I do think when you're conducting human rights due diligence, there's different levels to that, right? There's sort of your macro view of your supply chain, and then specific situations in particular supply chains, particular supply sheds, particular suppliers. Further down you get, the easier it is to do, right? And so again, I think it is this idea of using a lot of different tools to try to elevate what's actually happening to workers rather than making assumptions. I also say I'm often surprised by what we find. The issues we think we're going to find aren't always what we find. And so assumptions can be really dangerous. But I would just say use more tools and do it consistently and have it be part of the way you approach. It should be built in and integrated.
Brilliant. Mark?
So, we often say, if you really want to know what's happening to workers at the workplace or the recruitment, channels, you have to speak with workers themselves. So I think first and foremost, it's really about shifting, evolving from very much an audit compliance approach to one that's sort of beyond audit, where there's more opportunities to be engaging, whether that's at the factory level or at the community level. And then I think once you have more opportunities then to hear what's happening, at the broader community levels too, especially as you go further upstream in supply chains, there's probably a lot more opportunities for different collaborations, for partnerships. And so I think having more conversations of what's happening sort of at that ecosystem level becomes really, really advantageous.
Excellent.
Well, I would say how workers' voice be normalized. I would say also why. We need to analyze why it should be normalized. It should be normalized because it is what makes it work. If workers are at the bottom of any supply chain speaking up, they are gonna let any system in place know what the problems and where the problems are. The how, we have done it through campaigning, bringing different corporations on board. We have done it through connecting with different players that are interested in other parts of the globe. We have created infrastructures like the WSR network together with other groups to be able to address these conversations and push the narrative that is necessary in this country. So the how, I think, depends on where you are, but the how, the why is very important. We need to find ways to be able to have the workers able, free, and unafraid to speak up, which means they need to be protected. We need to build power around that. In terms of the other question, to what extent we have been involved in legislative efforts, We have not, as our main focus, ever do legislative work. It has happened backwards, at the inverse. We have bring the power of the market to change conditions in the fields. In that context, the law becomes the basis. Laws that were dormant, we bring them up and we apply them within the program. And then on top of it, we build new rights, like the right to have shade in the fields, which is something that doesn't exist by law. And through legislation, I see it very difficult for us to land something like that. So we need to think, in terms of power. Where is the power? And seek for it to be able to then change the conditions at the bottom. In terms of wider solidarity, why this is rare? Well, I think that we have a whole universe of interests that are not aligned with this. And we need to figure out what those interests are on the part of different corporations to let them know that this is not something that is going to damage in any way their business model. If anything, this is going to make it work in a way in which they can guarantee that in their supply chain there's no abuses of human rights, that people don't have to give up their dignity to be able to provide profits at the top. It's not about that. It's about collaborating. It's about harnessing the power that they already have and directing it towards where it matters to avoid people having to give up their most precious thing, which is their dignity, the ability to have what they need for the families. It's as basic as that.
There are 2 questions left, and I'm going to cheekily, because we've run out of time, sadly, say that the one actually was answered in our panel by Gerardo about how we replicate that model in other sectors. They are doing that work in garment, in the garment sector and elsewhere. But you're welcome to talk to him later about that. And then just in closing, the last question that we haven't answered is about tech and the way in which sometimes, depending on the particular solution for the grievance system, grievance mechanisms, for example, do place the burden on an individual worker to step forward and report an issue. And is that appropriate and fair in all circumstances? And I'm going to be naughty and step forward and answer that myself in closing the panel. And it resonates with a lot of the issues we've already covered. Empowerment and full information and safe channels and solid follow-up and tying what's voiced to the bigger picture and to changing standards as well as changing legislation is all extremely important. But we have to make the user experience for the worker easy. We have to lower the Dutch have this term drempel. We have to lower the threshold that discourages a lot of workers, migrant workers in highly problematic situations from stepping forward and raising their hand. How do we do that? Also using tech tools that unlock scalable kind of, scalable voice channels. By alongside kind of incident reporting lines that depend on the individual to step forward, also introduce a rhythm of worker voice monitoring in a way that monitors working conditions as operation normal across the workforce. So to destigmatize and take the pressure off the individual and recognize that not all individuals will use traditional grievance mechanisms. In fact, most workers won't. So what do we do about that? Let's ensure that the other tools in that important tool suite that Amy keeps talking about, lower the obstacle for migrant workers and ensure that it's destigmatized, fully anonymous, to Mark's point, and that reporting becomes an operation normal, and to ensure that we collate all that insight that we hear from migrant workers again and again and again, and make sure that it does indeed end up impacting on standards, to Gerardo's point, and finally to regulation that we all looking forward to. Thank you so much for your patience. Brilliant.